Good morning. Welcome to the Energy and Environment track of the 2022 Iowa Ideas Conference. I'm Erin Jordan. I'm an investigative reporter for the Gazette, and I have the pleasure of being the moderator for the first panel of the morning about carbon dioxide pipelines. Do they have a public benefit? Discussion of the science, evidence, and potential impact of CO2 sequestration. This session, which goes until I think about 10:10, will include talking with our panelists, who will introduce themselves in just a minute, and addressing audience questions. All of our sessions have closed captioning access and all are recorded, so you can listen to them again and again and again in the future. Before we get started, we have a quick message from our track sponsor, Alliant Energy. I'd like to have each of our panelists do a really quick introduction of themselves, telling us who they are and their connection with our topic of CO2 sequestration. Let's start with Charles.
Hi, I'm a professor in chemical and biochemical engineering at the University of Iowa. I've been here 18 years, and before that I did a PhD with a research focus in atmospheric composition. Here at Iowa, I do research and teaching in energy systems and greenhouse gases and atmospheric chemistry. And I was on the energy work group of the carbon task force that the governor set up last year. And we run a high accuracy CO2 and greenhouse gas monitoring station here in Eastern Iowa.
Thank you. John?
John Satterfield with Summit Carbon Solutions. Perhaps you've heard of us there in Iowa. We are in the process of executing a project for carbon capture, transport, sequestration, primarily focused today on ethanol facilities in 5 states, including Iowa. I've got a background in environmental science. I've been in environmental consulting and in industry for almost 30 years now, which is kind of scary to say, but here to talk about our project and hopefully have some good dialogue.
Thank you. Bill?
My name is Bill Caram, and I am the Executive Director of the Pipeline Safety Trust. And the Pipeline Safety Trust was formed after a pipeline tragedy in Bellingham, Washington in 1999. The gasoline pipeline ruptured. The gasoline eventually ignited and it killed 3 boys. And we are in existence to make sure that no other community or other families have to go through what Bellingham and the families of those boys went through. After learning about the event in Satterfield, Mississippi, we got involved in CO2 pipelines and released a white paper earlier this year about the unique safety risks and regulatory shortfalls of CO2 pipelines.
Thank you. And you're on the West Coast, so we appreciate you joining us bright and early in the morning here.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
So one of the big questions, and we're already got a couple questions in from audience members, but one of the things we wanted to start off with is, under state and federal law, a municipal government or private company may take private property for public benefit as long as they pay landowners a fair market value. It's called eminent domain. In Eastern Iowa, eminent domain's been used to build highways, develop shopping areas, other pipelines, things like that. But the law requires the project to quote, serve a public use. John, I was hoping you could, start us off. There's 3, right, as of now, 3 proposed pipelines in the state. But if you could tell us a little bit about how Summit sees the public uses of its project, a proposed pipeline through, I believe, 5 states to a sequestration site in North Dakota.
Sure. I think whenever we talk about public use, public benefit, I think there's a legal conversation, and then there's a more bigger picture conversation, I think. So the legal conversation first. Our pipeline project meets the definitions of a public use just laid out by the state and federal laws. Our pipeline will provide services to customers. There's onloading areas, on-ramp areas into our pipe. There will be once it's in place, and it meets the definitions in the state rules for a public use, and by getting its permit. We're actually going through the permitting process right now. So from a legal perspective, by providing that service to multiple entities in the future, we would be a public use, provide a public benefit. From a bigger picture perspective, that's the other side. There's a push, not just nationally, but internationally, for a low carbon market, low carbon economies. And the consensus is that carbon captured sequestration will play a vital part in that transition from where we are today to a low carbon future, as we go from oil and gas, high emissions of CO2 from different industrial sources to a lower carbon emissions. And so I think that is the kind of touchy-feely, bigger picture public benefit of the project.
Now, that I think that, one of the things that I've heard quite a bit about is just, how much CO2 would be sequestered and the impact that might have on our kind of global goals to reduce the, carbon out there, because it's a potent greenhouse gas. We'll turn to you again, John. How much CO2 does the summit plan to sequester each year?
Right now, we have approximately 9 million metric tons per year under contract with our partners. The design capacity of the system will handle up to 18 million metric tons per year. And that equates, that 18 million equates roughly to about 3.9 million automobiles, the emissions of 3.9 million automobiles. And that there's 4.25 million automobiles that are registered as of 2020 in the 5 states our project sits in. So that's give you hopefully a better idea of what 18 million metric tons per year would look like.
Now that sounds like a lot. It is a lot in going toward the U.S. goals for reducing CO2 in the atmosphere. But I know there's some question of the CO2 and other greenhouse gases generated from growing corn needed to produce the ethanol that would be, the CO2 would come from. Charles, I know this is something that you've looked a little bit into. Would you mind talking with us about that?
Sure. Putting aside the corn part for a moment, because that gets a little complicated, but just if we captured the 18 million that John mentioned is for multiple states, if we just captured all fermentation CO2 from all ethanol refineries just in Iowa, that's about 14 million metric tons. But I don't think all those facilities can be reached. Some of them are going to be small, not on the pipelines. The pipelines won't operate all the time due to downtime, maintenance downtime, either at the onload location or at the injection location. So you have to back off from the full potential 14 million down to something lower. And then the operation and building the pipeline and then operating the compression and liquefaction systems, and then the vehicle fleets that are going to be going up and down for maintenance and inspections of the pipeline all emit as well. And so while you're putting, 10 million metric tons underground, you're emitting 1 or 2 from operations. And so you have to do the net, right, which then comes to something a bit lower. And I've been trying to find publicly released statements about what that life cycle assessment looks like for these projects. And I haven't found it so far. And I asked the participants at the energy work group about that, and didn't provide that information. I know it is available because it's part of the permitted applications for these facilities. Turning to the corn side, I mean, it's just ethanol is not a very low carbon fuel to start with. It's about 70 to 80% of the carbon intensity of gasoline, depending on what numbers you use for the nitrous oxide emissions from the fertilizer. And this will bring it down substantially, but it's still going to be 30%, 40% of the intensity of gasoline, whereas you can move to battery electric vehicles and be much lower than those numbers. So it's just it's like an opportunity cost. We're going to invest billions of dollars of taxpayer money in this solution, and that's going to, take money off the table for some more efficient solutions that would get us farther down the decarbonization pathway more quickly.
John, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Couple of points. One, completely understand that there's the secondary and tertiary emissions involved with our project. Our calculations are the about 10% of our carbon capture will be re-emitted in the power necessary to capture, compress, push, and then inject the CO2 downhole in North Dakota, the sequestration site. From a timing perspective, we will be working with the ethanol plants. They'll have scheduled times where they go down for maintenance work on the plant. We'll do the same, so that the opportunity to capture or the emissions, if we were to go down whenever they were still operating, we're going to try to minimize that as best we can. There will be emissions during maintenance activities along the pipeline. We'll have to blow down sections of it to run tools down the pipeline for inspection purposes, to make sure we understand any sort of integrity issues. All of those things are true. And so our best calculation today is that the emissions are going to be about 10%. That's scope 2 for those of you who are into CO2 calculation nerdery like I am, and Charles, I'm sure, is much more than I am. And so what we'll be calculating and tracking every single molecule of CO2 that comes into the system. We have to for our compliance with EPA regulations, our compliance with CARB, California Air Resources Boards, for the low carbon fuel standard allocations. And so while those things are true, we expect them to be minimal over time, and we'll be recording all those things and reporting on those things publicly.
One question I wanted to just offer up to Charles or Bill: how do you feel about that public use question? I know the Pipeline Safety Trust works with all different sorts of pipelines. How do you feel? Do you feel these projects meet that public use requirement for eminent domain?
I think let's take a step back and look at eminent domain historically. Originally it was purely for government, road construction, sewers, things like that really were kind of unquestionably public good, and there was no private gain as a part of that. And over time, its scope has expanded. It went to utilities. They were determined to be a public good, even though some of the utility companies were private. And then eventually it was expanded to whatever the legislature determined was public good. And that's where we are now. And given, this gets a little beyond the scope of the Pipeline Safety Trust, but just, given the track record of CCS, and then in our wheelhouse, the safety issues of CO2 pipelines, I think there's an important question of does it really meet the public good?
And just as a note, CCS is carbon capture and sequestration. Charles, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I see it as a mix. There is a public benefit, but it's combined with disbenefits, with risks, inefficient use of tax dollars and opportunity cost. And then you lock in this technology, you're basically betting on ethanol as a transportation fuel for the future. Now, I would love to see these pipelines 10 years from now be repurposed for industrial emissions that we don't have a good alternative for, and we can move the transportation system to electricity. So I do see it as this mix. I mean, the CO2, the drop in the regional CO2 emissions is not zero, right? It's in probably in the single digits in terms of an overall percent, maybe 8, 9, 10% for Iowa for CO2 reduction if this was fully implemented, counting both the CO2 that's injected and the emissions that John was talking about from operations. In terms of our total footprint, we have a lot of nitrous oxide emissions and methane emissions from the ag sector. So if we're looking at a 10% reduction in our CO2 is not a 10% emission in our greenhouse gases. It's more like a 5% reduction in our greenhouse gases.
If
A question.
If I may,
go ahead.
To Charles's points, a couple of things. We have a partnership right now with John Deere looking at how farming practices can minimize emissions of CO2. That's an ongoing research project, just started up earlier this year. And so completely understand and agree with your point about farming practices and emissions of CO2. And there's opportunities there to reduce those. And so that's part of our remit today. Secondly, right now, ethanol plants, the fermentation is the focus of the project because that's the lowest hanging fruit. That's an extremely clean, relatively speaking, source of CO2 from an industrial source that we can capture easily and transport and sequester. We have, like I said, 9 million more or less under contract, 18 million plus or minus in the design capacity. And there are other opportunities. There's an MOU getting ready to be signed between North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, I can't remember the fourth state, for hydrogen hubs. And blue hydrogen needs CCUS to be net zero or near net zero. There are direct air capture opportunities as well. And so while I understand the focus today has been on ethanol, and that's been part of our story because we think it's very important from an agricultural the economics and the economies in these 5 states. There's other things that other opportunities as well that can utilize this infrastructure in the future.
What other industries do you think could tap into these pipelines? I know there's some connections with fertilizer production. Are there anything else, any other partnerships that Summit is pursuing?
So there's other projects that have tied into or will be tying into fertilizer plants. Those are conversations we're having as well with other sources, the fertilizer sources. There's other ethanol and biodiesel sources. There's renewable aviation fuels sources as well. There's lots of opportunities on that agricultural / biofuels side. And again, to my point of a second ago, hydrogen is another alternative energy source that is being explored rather heavily by this administration and internationally. And if you use natural gas to produce the hydrogen, which is a way of doing it, you have carbon dioxide emissions. And so you need carbon capture and sequestration to minimize those carbon emissions and make blue hydrogen more attractive.
Question from an audience member. How much energy will be used across the state for pumping stations, pressurizing valves, et cetera? What kind of exploration has been made about that impact on local rural electric cooperatives?
So as of today, we are reaching out to the local power providers. We are agnostic at this point as to what that power comes from. We are also exploring opportunities for renewables, either direct connect or otherwise, so that we can decrease it's called scope 2, it's the emissions, the power use for our project. We're trying to reduce those emissions as best we can. But again, we've been agnostic at first in just where can we get the power, and then secondly, we're looking at opportunities where we can reduce those emissions over time.
How critical is CO2 sequestration to the future of ethanol, which is obviously a major business in Iowa? I think we have 40 plus ethanol plants here. And how big of a factor should that be in the conversation of public use? Just throw that out to the whole panel.
I feel like I've talked a lot. I was looking for this.
I mean, I haven't thought of it from that perspective of, what's the future of ethanol as a fuel with and without sequestration. I mean, if this qualifies the fuel to meet renewable fuel standards such as California's, it's going to increase the potential buyers of the fuel, and that would help keep it competitive. Now, for how long and how much more competitive, I don't know.
Yeah, and the Pipeline Safety Trust hasn't looked at that at all.
Yeah, so about 40% roughly of the corn in the country is sold for biofuel use, and I'll set aside the discussion of whether that's a good idea or not. That's a fact that the economies have been set up such that that's what's occurring today, and so there's farmers selling their corn to ethanol plants and biodiesel plants and other sources today, and that's where they're getting good value for their corn crops, and their land values are higher because of that. Again, facts. It's not a moral question in my opinion. That's just the facts. And so, if ethanol can have a increase in their profit margins and in their market penetration, that is good for that entire value chain. Today, we've got low carbon fuel standard markets on the West Coast, California, Oregon, Washington State, British Columbia, and Canada. And there's low carbon fuel standard considerations from a legislative perspective in several other states across the country, and others where it's being played around with and talked about, but nothing serious has been brought to the table. And so the market for low carbon fuel standard markets, as we move to a lower carbon economy, it is imperative that these ethanol plants are able to penetrate those markets, because again, the economies that are set up to support them. From a transportation fuel perspective, whether it's electric vehicles or otherwise, as we see in California, the spend in just charging facilities across the state to support their remit on banning gasoline vehicles or liquid fuel vehicles is enormous. The infrastructure necessary to deploy ethanol already exists. It's every gas station, whether it's E10, E15, E85. And so the infrastructure spend is minimal for the deployment of that fuel source as we transition to whatever the low carbon fuel markets would be 10 years, 15, 20 years down the road, in my opinion.
Changing gears here just a bit, at informational meetings about the pipeline projects, many Iowans have brought up concerns about safety of CO2 pipelines. Bill, I know you've been studying this at the Pipeline Safety Trust. Could you talk with us about some of the primary concerns?
Sure, yeah. So, like I mentioned, we really had focused on hydrocarbon pipelines as an organization, and then after seeing what happened in Satterfield when a pipeline failure led to 50 people going to the hospital and a pretty harrowing experience, we started learning a lot about CO2 pipelines and the unique safety risks that they pose. This really first came up in the 80s when there was a natural release of CO2 from a lake in Africa, in Cameroon, and it spread and killed every oxygen breathing thing within 18 miles of that lake, 1,700 people. And that's when Congress first took notice and said, you know, we need to start regulating CO2 pipelines. There's been so few mileage of CO2 pipelines. You know, we have over 3 million miles of hydrogen carbon pipelines, and there's only 5,000 miles of CO2 pipelines. So it really has been in a bit of a, you know, in its infancy. So we found things like, you know, because it's heavier than air, because it doesn't ignite, it's an asphyxiant, it can, after a failure, it can stay close to the ground and move in kind of unpredictable ways. And it's not like other hydrocarbons. And so using formulas for finding out how, you know, what the area of danger around a pipeline is doesn't really work for CO2 pipelines. We also found that the regulations were really far behind, that they're very specific as to what type of CO2 is actually regulated. And a lot of other kinds of moving CO2 through pipelines isn't regulated at all. There's no regulations on, you know, corrosive or toxic impurities in the pipeline. There's no requirement for an odorant, and the fact that it has no odor, once the dry ice crystals melt, it's invisible, and so people might not know that there's been a CO2 pipeline rupture as they're getting asphyxiated. Yeah, I encourage anybody interested in learning more. We have a report on our website. It should be relatively easy to find. And there's a list at the end of that report and our backgrounder that points out all the unique safety risks and regulatory shortfalls.
And just as a little more background about that February 2021 accident in Mississippi, the explosion of a CO2 pipeline there, I feel like this really seemed to capture the national attention, in part because the CO2 just kind of robbed the air of oxygen in this low-lying area, and the people were passing out in their vehicles. Emergency response vehicles were not able to get there because their engines wouldn't work. You know, I wondered if we could talk just a minute about what project coordinators, maybe you have some insight, John, into what they might have learned from this incident.
Sure. So first off, make sure we differentiate between the results and the cause. So the cause of the rupture was not unique to a CO2 pipeline. It would be the same if it was natural gas or oil. The pipe was perpendicular on a slope, and heavy rains washed out the soil around it, and it split because of its own weight. And that was the cause of the release. That's in the pipe. That's in the PHMSA report. So poor or inadequate, I should say, survey work, inadequate inspections, and inadequate addressing inadequate understanding of the potential issues that occur there. And so there's a lesson to be learned for pipeline companies, whether it's Summit Carbon Solutions or any other company that's putting in new pipelines or has existing pipelines. When you have a geohazard like that, you need to up your inspections and make sure the soils are competent. And after the kinds of rains that we have been experiencing over the last several years, enhance your inspection program. So I think there's lots of lessons learned there. We have taken into account in our design of our project. From a impact perspective, yeah, that should never have happened. The split shouldn't have happened, and then there was a delay in notifying local emergency responders what was going on. And so what we have taken from that learning experience is we have gone out and met with every single county emergency manager in the footprint of our project, whether it's in Iowa or the other 4 states. We are now, that's already occurred. We're also circling back around now, meeting with all the local emergency planning commissions, which are a group of people, including the emergency manager, to talk about our project. We're also meeting with emergency responders, first responders, and talking about the kinds of equipment they might need, what kind of training they might need. And then we will be continuing that conversation, because it's a continuing conversation over time as the project goes from planning to construction to operation. And we'll have meetings with those emergency responders on an annual basis at minimum, doing desktop exercises and perhaps even drills.
One question that came from the audience along these lines, they mention that they would like to see the risk assessment, the plume modeling, and emergency response plans made public. They feel that Summit perhaps hasn't done that. Are there plans to make those plans public because of how important they are to first responders?
We'll be having conversations in Iowa with the IUB to talk through those specific issues. Again, we're meeting with the emergency responders in each one of these counties along our pipeline routes, including the communities, the cities, if there's towns and municipalities, tribes, in cases where we near tribal boundaries, to talk about what happens if there is an incident, what kind of response, what kind of evacuations, and things of those natures.
And to what degree do you think pipeline operators should be responsible for providing training and even specific equipment to some of these local emergency response groups?
I think pipeline companies are responsible for meeting with emergency responders along their pipeline routes already, and so I think that's a good business practice, even if it's required by regulation. And so we are doing that already. And if there's inadequate equipment, we'll have that conversation with individual response groups and work with them on how to best supply them.
I had someone that I was talking with the other day. They said that it might be ironic that you might need an electric vehicle to respond to a pipeline, a CO2 pipeline explosion, because the other vehicles wouldn't run. But Bill, how would you, what would you like CO2 pipeline companies to be doing and be keeping in mind with keeping landowners safe, people who live near these pipelines?
Yeah, so, PHMSA is the federal regulator. They're part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. And after they completed their investigation of Satterfield and our report came out, they recognized that it is true that the regulations are not modernized for this kind of build out of CO2 pipelines. And they've announced a rulemaking that to modernize and update the safety regulations, that there are knowledge gaps on the technology and there are regulatory gaps on keeping these pipelines safe. And one of the interesting things with this particular regulatory agency is that certain parts of their regulations that have to do with design and construction standards, they have a legacy clause in their statute where they're not allowed to apply to existing pipelines. So one of the concerns that we have as a safety organization is that it's going to take a while for this new rulemaking. It will take at least several years. And that any pipelines that go on the ground between now and then, if there are updates to some of these safety standards, like a construction standard to prevent, fracture propagation, these kind of violent ruptures that can happen from a CO2 pipeline, running ductile fractures, things like that, they won't be allowed to tell operators that they have to go back into the pipeline that's in the ground to update them. And we will have these pipelines built on outdated safety regulations. I think a lot of this, not just the rulemaking showing that this is true, but PHMSA also came out with a R&D project recently that really showed a lot of the knowledge gaps that we have. They're looking at things like, what kind of steel quality should be used to prevent leaks and ruptures. what are the effects of corrosion and dents on a CO2 pipeline in a supercritical state? I mean, these are pretty fundamental questions that PHMSA is asking researchers to figure out. And you know, that R&D project's going to take a couple of years. And so one of our concerns, like I said, as an organization, is that these pipelines are being built before these knowledge gaps and regulatory gaps are being filled.
I wanted to just talk briefly, Charles, as you mentioned, you were part of Governor Kim Reynolds' CO2 sequestration task force. You know, that group, I don't think is meeting any longer. I don't know if you have a sense of what some of the big picture findings of the group were.
The group is not meeting and issued a final report. And I mean, I'm looking at the report here. I mean, the basic idea was to promote carbon capture in agricultural soils through soil management, and to do that through research and joint projects between researchers and producers to come up with the necessary databases of this practice on the farm leads to this much carbon, and then how can that be monitored and verified and then monetized. So a lot of the effort was on that. I think a lot of the effort was to kick off the carbon pipelines, and you know, the 45Q tax credit was a maybe, right, when we were meeting, and now it's signed into law. So in some sense, it's sort of mission accomplished for the task force to establish this new way of producing biofuels and doing it with carbon sequestration. I had a question for John, if he could lead us through how the 45Q money will flow in these types of projects. And I had a second unrelated question about how are the injection sites monitored, but I guess it's up to our moderator whether those rise to the level of the discussion or whether there's audience questions that should be taken.
Yeah, no, that's fine. John, if you want to address either or both of those, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, I'm certainly not an expert on the 45Q tax credit. I do understand, though, as I talked about a second ago, we have to monitor and track every single molecule of CO2 to meet several different regulatory burdens with EPA and CARB and whatnot. For 45Q, we have to show that the CO2 was captured and then was subsequently deposited or injected at the sequestration facility. And so for every ton that's permanently sequestered, it's currently $85 a ton. That money will be paid to us.
From the Treasury, federal Treasury, correct. It cuts a check to.
It's a tax credit, but it's going to be cash, as I understand it. From a sequestration tracking and monitoring perspective, so we've been extensive plume modeling of how the CO2 should react and will react in the formations into which we'll be injecting. We've installed monitoring wells around that so that we can track how that plume propagates, and then we'll be reporting on that on a continual basis on the injection itself, and then the monitoring stations as part of our permit application. The permit we'll get from the State Industrial Commission there in North Dakota, who've been granted primacy by EPA for the Class 6 program.
Well, I guess when I was asking about in monitoring in the injection site, I was thinking of third-party monitoring, independent monitoring. You're talking about your kind of self-monitoring.
Right. I'm unsure of what third-party monitoring will be occurring other than the agency itself. We'll have to report again to EPA, to the Industrial Commission, also part of some of our other reporting with CARB. And so we will have an extensive monitoring and reporting plan in place. We're developing with that right now. We're talking about that with CARB. And so as far as a third party doing some monitoring as well, I'm unsure of whether that's actually going to occur or not. When we've got layers upon layers upon layers of reporting we were obligated to make, and we're obligated to allow audits at whatever point in time by those agencies.
Question from the audience. They wanted to know, I guess, just for the Summit project, but how much of the CO2 would be used for enhanced oil recovery in North Dakota? I know there's some question, it can be injected into these former oil sites to kind of extract all the remainder. How much of that do you anticipate?
Zero. We're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on a sequestration facility in North Dakota, setting up the programs I just talked about a second ago, injection wells, monitoring wells, equipment. We have to lease the pore space from the surface owners so that we can inject into them. Hundreds of millions of dollars of expense for that facility. The pipeline ends at the facility. It doesn't go any further. We're miles and miles away from any sort of historic oil and gas operations. All that's to the west in the Bakken. We're east of that by good ways, and so we're going to be sequestering this permanently at our facility.
So far, Summit is the first and only company, I believe, to officially apply for the permit in application there with the Iowa Utilities Board. And that's the group that will make the decision about whether eminent domain can be used for this project. John, could you give us a little update on where we are in that process, that permitting process?
Sure. We filed our permit application in at the very end of January of this year. We're expecting the next steps from a hearing perspective sometime hopefully in the spring of 2023, and that would be the conversation about what the utility board has about our project. There'll be hearings hopefully that will introduce testimony and things of that nature. So that's where we are today with the permitting process. We would hope to have a permit in hand to be able to start construction towards the end of the summer or fall of 2023.
Now, are there any hearings or I guess, what steps need to happen before that? And
yeah, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. So we're hoping to have maybe some hearings in the spring. That's when we hope to have those, and by having those, then we can talk through all of the issues with the board. They can ask questions. We can present testimony and evidence, and then we hopefully will have our permit in hand at the end of the summer or the fall of 2023.
Could you also give us an update on where land acquisition stands with your project?
We're over 50%. I think we're 56% right now, landowners that have signed up with us voluntarily. And we're making headway every day with different landowners, talking through what their project's about, what the pipeline looks like when it crosses their property, where on their property would be the best place to place it, because they may have future plans for a barn or a road or something like that. So we're making great progress.
In terms of how long the project's been out there, it's been over a year now, I think. Am I about right when you first posted for the informational meetings?
Yes. So it's been a little bit over a year now.
Okay.
About this time last year.
Okay. So for there's 40-some% of landowners who haven't provided voluntary easements. I mean, it seems like they've had plenty of opportunity. Besides the eminent domain, what are your plans to kind of get more voluntary easements?
Well, I think it can be a drawn out process. This isn't unusual for a pipeline project of this size and scope, to have longer conversations with landowners. People want to talk through the issues from their mind. They want to feel comfortable about the project. They want to feel like they've been treated with respect. They want to have what they believe is an appropriate offer. And so it's a negotiation process.
So we were talking about the utilities, the Iowa Utilities Board a little bit. Bill, could you give us a little bit of some information about how the federal government, through the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, what their review looks like?
They don't actually, PHMSA doesn't actually have a permitting process for a new pipeline. For natural gas pipelines, that would be FERC. And for liquids lines and the CO2, because it's in a supercritical fluid state, is considered a liquids line, it really is up to state and local governments to permit the pipeline. Where PHMSA steps in, which again is the safety agency under Department of Transportation, is setting those minimum safety standards for the construction of the pipeline, so it's built safely, and safe operation inspections while it's operating, and they are not involved in the siting or permitting of the actual pipeline.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, I think that was something that probably myself and others might not be clear on. Another question from the audience, they wanted to know who owns the land where the CO2 would be stored, and if that's kind of a different process for land acquisition.
So the way it works is the surface owner owns the pore space. So you've got a permeable and porous rock formation into which we'll be injecting. And I know it's kind of a mind bender, but the person who owns the surface property owns the pore space. And so we negotiate with that surface owner so we can inject into that pore space. They keep their property. We're just leasing the pore space for the injection of the CO2.
Another audience question here. California recently passed a ban on the sale of new gas combustion vehicles by 2035. Other states headed in that direction. What happens to these pipelines if they're built and the ethanol industry begins to decline and you've kind of got them in a route around these ethanol plants?
So as I said a little bit ago now, that the ethanol plants are the low-hanging fruit today from a CO2 source perspective. There are other opportunities out there as well for this project. So the pipeline, the infrastructure is going to have, in our minds, use for decades, for a long time, capturing CO2 from industrial sources. We believe the ethanol industry has a long life ahead of it, regardless of what California decides to do with gasoline powered engines, industrial combustion engines.
Well, we just have a few more minutes here today, but I wanted to kind of pose a last question to our panelists. If you had a few minutes, 5 minutes with the ear of the Iowa Utilities Board with regard to CO2 pipelines, what would you like to tell them? And whoever wants to start first.
I can go first. To me, the important thing is to think about the full carbon picture, the full carbon accounting. Scope 1, which is what's emitted directly from the facility. Scope 2, which is what's emitted by your electricity provider, who's providing electricity to run your systems. And Scope 3, which is all the stuff that you need, all the materials such as the pipeline steel emits. And so I just am encouraging a broad look at the net balance. Don't look at the gross, look at the net. With any business, you need to look at both the profit and the loss side.
Bill, did you want to go next?
Sure. I would ask that they really look hard at the current knowledge gaps and regulatory gaps, as I spoke about before, that have yet to be filled. You know, the PHMSA asked people to research appropriate fracture toughness, the effects of corrosion and dents on CO2 pipelines. And the biggest one to me is that there really is no settled science on the best plume dispersion modeling to be used in various terrain and weather conditions. And there's just a lot of research to be done. And on the other side, there's a lot of regulatory gaps to be filled. There's no standards on impurities, and there's these gaps on what's even considered a CO2 to be regulated in the first place. And so I would just say, please take all that seriously and ask, are we ready for these pipelines to be built, or would it be better to have these gaps filled first?
And John?
I would simply ask, what are your concerns? What questions do you have about our project that we haven't already answered, or you don't understand, and how can we best explain that or address it so that you understand and are satisfied with our response?
Do you feel like, to some degree, because you're the first project to go through the permitting process, that you're forging some ground that the other companies are learning from?
Yes, definitely.
That's probably a little bit frustrating at times.
I'm a firstborn child, and I imagine every firstborn child is a trailblazer in their family, and we're living the firstborn child life right now, because we are the first movers in this space.
Yeah. Well, we are going to leave the conversation there. There's so much more to learn about this topic, and I think we'll have other opportunities through written pieces and other conversations. But thank you so much to our panelists, John Satterfield with Summit Carbon Solutions, Bill Caram with the Pipeline Safety Trust, and Charles Stanier, a University of Iowa engineering professor. And thank you to our online audience. I saw we had more than 50 people here for this conversation, which is great. The next energy and environment session, which starts at 10:20, I think, is on solar energy myths versus reality. But we hope you all come back for our energy environment tracks as we move forward for the rest of the day. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.